Hello again. It's my pleasure to join you guys in a little bit of a deep dive of the burning bush story, roughly in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Now, last time, if you remember, we looked at a few points of connection between the Genesis story and Moses' birth story, and also some connections between Moses' story and Israel's story later in the book. Specifically, this parallel where Moses is taken from the water and from the reeds, just like Israel would pass through the sea of reeds. So that introduced us to the idea that Israel's experience parallels and follows the pattern of Moses' experience. And we're going to explore more of that today in the burning bush story. And actually, with that kind of perspective, there's a really cool truth that we're going to discover. Setting the stage in Exodus 3, we read that Moses was pasturing the flock of his father-in-law. So he's living as a shepherd, and we read he's taking his flock westward, and he arrives to Horeb, to the mountain of God. This, of course, is Mount Sinai, we typically call it, but here it's called Horeb. Horeb means dryness, so probably what it's referring to is a dry wilderness area within which Mount Sinai found itself. This is maybe why there's different words for Mount Sinai in the Old Testament. But there's no mistake, he comes to Mount Sinai. This is the mountain of God. Now, big picture, let's think for a moment. Moses, he's shepherding a flock, and he's leading it to Mount Sinai. Now, later in the book, Moses is going to shepherd Israel, and he's going to lead them to Mount Sinai. So here Moses is being prepared, maybe, for what he's going to do later in shepherding Israel to Mount Sinai. This is another one of those connections. Next up, we have the famous story of the burning bush, or the not-so-burning bush, where Moses encounters God. And this is the first place in the Bible where the word holy occurs, which is significant because this story is going to give us a framework for what that means. It's going to introduce us to the concept of God's holiness and prepare us to continue into the rest of the Torah and the Old Testament understanding this term. Okay, so what's important to notice here is that holiness is not moral perfection. That's not necessarily what holiness means. Notice in the story that God says, the ground on which you stand is holy. So the ground's not a moral agent. Okay, so if the ground's holy, holiness has something else to do than being righteous, and so on and so forth. Really, holiness is the chief characteristic of God. It describes his transcendence. That's the key sense to holy. It's God's utter transcendence, his separateness, how he is totally other from this world. And this divine transcendence, when it shows up in our world, and when it manifests, we experience this as glory. Okay, so that'll help us understand holiness. It's God's utter transcendence, and we get a flavor of it in glory, in awesomeness. Most of the time, fire. Hebrew says our God is a consuming fire, and that's how God appears here in this visible awesomeness called glory, fire. But it's a glory so intense, so pure, that it's actually dangerous for mere mortal beings. That's why God warns Moses, don't come any closer. And Moses is scared, rightfully so, because he is in the danger zone. A helpful metaphor for understanding holiness is the sun. The sun is a good force. It supports life, and it's awesome. It's glorious. We receive its light. We feel its heat, and it's concentrated outside of our world. So it's holy. It's separate, and it has a glory. It has a heat and a power, life-giving power. But it's dangerous. The closer you get to it, the hotter it is, and eventually you can't stand it. So the same with God. His presence is here at the bush, and it creates a zone of glory, a zone of holiness that is dangerous to Moses, so he's warned not to come any closer. Okay, as a side note, holiness does end up having to do with righteousness later, having to do with moral virtue, but that derives from this concept of transcendence. It's secondary. And how is that? Well, when we think of God's holiness, his transcendence, his total otherness from this world, we get a contrast. We contrast what we are versus what he is. And in Israel's testimony, that was sinfulness, unfaithfulness. And so when they thought of their other God, who was totally separate and other than they were, they knew that he's not susceptible to the same problems: sin, unfaithfulness, impurity. And so they knew because he was holy, he could be trusted and he could be faithful to his promises, unlike themselves. So that's how this idea of transcendent otherness, glory, got connected to this idea of faithfulness and holiness and moral virtue. But that's secondary. Okay, so again, zooming out, remember Israel has the same encounter at Sinai. When they get to Mount Sinai later in the book, and we're going to look at it, but there, God introduces himself to Israel. He appears in a blazing firestorm on the mountain, and he warns them not to come any closer, lest they die. So it's the same experience of holiness that they're getting. Okay, so in summary, Moses is delivered from the water of reeds, escapes from Pharaoh, spends some time wandering around in the wilderness, encounters God's fiery presence. He's taught the concept of God's holiness, and he gets called for God's purposes. You could substitute Moses for Israel there, and it would be true. That timeline for Moses is exactly what happens to Israel. They pass through the Red Sea, they escape Pharaoh, they wander around in the wilderness, they come to God's fiery presence, they experience his holiness at this mountain. And so that's another one of these strong connections between Moses and Israel. As a cherry on top of all of that is that there's a good chance that Mount Sinai got its name from the bush, from the burning bush, or maybe the other way around. But there's probably a connection between the two places on purpose. And what I mean by that is that they sound very similar. So Mount Sinai sounds like bush in Hebrew, Sinai. So Sinai, Sinai. There's a good chance, we're not sure, but that they actually named the mountain after the bush because they were thinking about this connection. Anyway, this is all very cool, but why am I pointing it out? It helps us answer the following questions. Why does God's presence appear in a bush? And why is such a fragile thing not consumed? Why is it not annihilated by his glory? God could have, gotten Moses' attention 100, ways. Why did he choose this way? Why did he do this miracle, this wonder, just to get Moses' attention? Are we really to believe that it's just a divine attention-getting device? I don't think so. When we think of Sinai, together with Sinai, with the bush, we discover a really awesome truth about God's character. When God's presence descends on the mountain for Israel at Mount Sinai in chapter 19, the whole mountain trembled greatly, it says. But that's in contrast to the bush that sat calmly within the divine presence without burning up. It increases our curiosity. How come the great big mountain itself trembled and quaked under God's glory, but the bush peacefully sat there? It highlights the wonder of what Moses saw in chapter 3. So let's ask, what did it mean? Surely it wasn't just God, rules to get Moses' attention. What was he trying to communicate? Do we have something at Sinai, possibly, that is similar to what we see at the bush? Do we have something that could shed light on the burning bush episode from the Sinai episode? We do. So in Exodus 24, God's already given them the terms for the covenant, and Israel goes to agree with it, and they want to confirm it. And in Exodus 24, 4 through 11, this is what we read. And Moses wrote down all the words of Yahweh. Then he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men and the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to Yahweh. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that Yahweh has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "Behold, the covenant, the blood of the covenant, which Yahweh has cut with you in accordance with all these words." Then Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. Yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel, and they beheld God, and they ate, and they drank. They saw God, and were not consumed. The mountain quaked, but the fragile souls fellowshiped there with God without dying. The bush was not burnt up. Back at the bush episode, God promised Moses that he'd bring up Israel to worship at the same mountain. And here we read that being fulfilled. Moses is there too. Once Moses marveled at the sight of twigs and leaves and branches not being consumed by God's fire, now he's wondering, himself a part of this miraculous meal before God's very presence, what that could have meant. No doubt, as he beheld God himself on the mountain peacefully, he remembered the burning bush. Israel was the bush. And very frequently in the Old Testament, plants, trees, bushes, stems, all represent people very often, especially Israel. So the bush foreshadowed the intimacy Israel would have with their God and how this holy presence would dwell with them safely. It was possible for mere creatures to be close with the Holy One, even though he was a consuming fire. But how? How could that be possible? Because of the blood of the covenant, the sacrificial blood of the covenant. And praise be to Jesus for his blood in the new covenant, which prepares us to live in unhindered fellowship with God forever in a new creation. When we look again at the bush encounter as a whole, we see another remarkable thing. The bush episode is sandwiched between two statements about God's compassion, his compassionate attention and sympathetic care for his people. This alone teaches us about the wonderful character of Yahweh, but that's not all the passage reveals. By placing the burning bush between these statements of God's love and care, we're invited to compare and understand the bush in those terms. And what we find is that the same God who is unapproachable in his glory, who's utterly separate and transcendent from this world, dangerously so, is the same God who loves and cares for his people and sympathetically identifies with their pain. What a miracle. The consuming fire himself has the heart of a friend.